It's always funny to me because when people find out that I'm going to start farming, I get one of two reactions. One is, why? And the other is, I am so jealous. So I wanted to explain why I'm farming and why I picked a place like the high desert of the center of Utah in what to a lot of people would be the middle of nowhere. You see, growing up, when baseball season would end, I would come down to my grandpa's farm. And there was just something about the atmosphere down here. It was the love, the family, just being out in nature. It was all of that that just made this place incredible. I mean, it was fun because I'd come down here. My grandpa would wake us up by filling up a glass of water just a little bit. He'd walk into whatever bedroom you were sleeping in, and he'd throw the water on your face and tell you to get your dead butt onto your dying feet and get out of bed. And then as you got out of bed, he'd have warm, hot cakes for you. Usually we'd cover them with peanut butter and syrup, and we'd eat all that, and then we'd head out to feed the cattle. For years, we'd go over and feed the pigs after. Depending on the day, you might cut hay or bale hay. You might go to the cornfields. You might have to water or move pipe. You might have to do any of those things, but it was always fun. And then we'd come back and Grandma would have lunch ready for us. And it was just an amazing atmosphere. Usually after lunch, my grandma would do something with us for a little bit, whether that was watch a TV show or play a game. And then she almost always had Swan's ice cream in the freezer that she would hand us before we went out for the afternoon. Now, most afternoons, my grandpa would make us work with him, at least until the sun went down and we came in for supper. But every now and then he'd be like, go do whatever you want. And I remember walking along these riverbanks, particularly there was a trash pile, and we'd walk over to the trash pile and we would just look for bluebelly lizards. And we could spend hours catching bluebelly lizards. Or as I got older, my grandpa would pay us $1 a tail for every squirrel we shot because they would be digging into his fields and everything else. So we'd walk the roads along the edge of the field, and every time we saw a squirrel, half the time we'd waste 20 rounds before we finally got it, but we would eventually get the squirrel and we'd clear up my grandpa's fields for him. There was just something amazing about all the work that we had to do. I remember vividly on this very river, just a few feet away in fact, my grandpa wanted a fence going across the river because the neighbor's cows kept wandering onto his property. So he sent me and my cousin across the river, and he told us to pull this barbed wire fence across the river. And I got to the other side and I pulled and I pulled and I could not move that fence. And my grandpa, a little frustrated with me, shook his head and said, "You guys are being ridiculous, just pull it." And he jumped in his truck and he drove down to the road, started crossing the bridge, and I looked at my cousin and I said there was no way we were not going to get this fence across the river. So I grabbed on and I pulled with all my might until that fence started cutting into the palms of my hand. By the time I managed to pull that fence across, it had taken everything I had. My grandpa gets over there and he looks at us, and we proudly told him that we pulled the fence across the river. And he just laughs at us and says, "Why didn't you do that before I came over here?" And then he started driving away. So we had to run as fast as we could, jump onto the bumper, hold onto the tailgate, and then throw ourselves into the bed of the truck in order to get a ride back to the house. And while that may sound strange to some of you guys, it was some of the most fun that I've ever had in my entire life. The different games we'd play on the farm, playing cars and trucks on the front porch swing with my grandma, even helping her do a 1,000-piece puzzle. The time I spent farming was some of the most enjoyable and happy memories from my childhood. And so when it comes to why I want to farm here, it's because of the legacy my grandpa, my great-grandpa, my great-great-grandpa, and not just them, but the people in 11 different sides of my family left here in Sevier County. And that's why I want to farm in the middle of Utah. Plus, the views are not half bad. Part of what I want to do is a little unique, because if I were to fly the drone around here, you would see that almost every field around me is in corn, alfalfa, wheat. Most of the crops being grown here are all to support cattle, which is intriguing because there's an old sugar beet factory right across the road from the sugar beets that used to be grown here. As you read the family history of almost all my family members that lived out here, they were able to grow the vast majority of their food, meaning they were growing 100+ crops. So, 5 types of berries, 10 types of vegetables and lettuces and melons and potatoes, and anything that they could grow and store, they were growing and storing. And there's a part of me that wants to see this land returned to what it was. a farm that can produce not just for a family, but I'm gonna set it up so it can produce for hundreds of people. Because part of what I've done is, during my career, I started out in heating and air conditioning when I was 21. I started as a bilingual dispatcher for a plumbing, heating, and air conditioning contractor. Later, I was named the general manager. I had 45 employees, and I was running a rather large company. And yet, the desire to farm has been with me my entire life. From the time I was a little kid, I've dreamed of being able to farm this land. But heating and air gave me a unique advantage and some very unique ideas. I have purchased a huge amount of used greenhouses so that I can test out some of my theories that I have for a greenhouse that should be the most efficient greenhouse in the entire world once I'm done with it. And it'll be heated and cooled in a much more energy efficient methodology than what the vast majority of them are doing, because honestly, heating a greenhouse is expensive. And although there's lots of different ways to do it less expensively, the vast majority of what people are doing, that becomes the single biggest expense of the crops that they're producing. So my goal and why I want to farm is we're going to grow 100 plus crops this year on the farm, despite the fact that last year it was in cattle supporting crops. And we are going to get our greenhouses up. We're going to extend our season into the fall. We are going to make sure we're set up for next year. And we are going to be producing enough food to feed hundreds of people off of just a small portion of this farm so that we can show what can be done. So last year, for the first time, I attempted to grow stuff in my home garden. I built 23 raised garden beds in the backyard. We put in a chicken coop. We did all of this stuff so that we could attempt to learn how to farm when we eventually came down here, which is going to be this year. And so in what is less than basically 0.01 of an acre, maybe 0.02, we were producing over 100 pounds of food a week. We started most of the plants in the house, moved them out to the greenhouse to harden off, and then we moved stuff out to the raised garden beds very, very early last year because of the slightly warmer than normal spring. And so it was amazing because by the end of May, I was harvesting just ridiculous amounts of everything, from zucchini to pumpkins, tomatoes, cucumbers, every last thing you can imagine I was being able to pull out of my backyard. And we were giving away 80 plus pounds of food a week. My daughter started a project. She was part of the Sandy royalty, and so her project was called Gardening for Good, and she wanted to raise 500 pounds of food to give away to the people in our community that were in need. And it was really fun to watch because we were able to grow that food, have single moms come over, people who had, lost their job, people in all sorts of scenarios that just needed a little bit of extra help. And most of them, it was so great to hear their reaction, because so many of them, after they'd had our food for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, came back and they said, my kids won't eat vegetables, but anything they get from you, they love. Because we had set the garden beds up basically perfectly. The soil was ridiculous. So the quality of the vegetables that we were getting out of there was amazing. I mean, I would eat 5, 10 tomatoes a day, sometimes cherry tomatoes, sometimes the larger ones, just because they were so incredibly good you could eat them by themselves. I know some people would have put a little bit of salt on them, but you could literally eat them by themselves. And it saddens me because Utah, Sevier County specifically for my family, but Utah in general has such a legacy of self-sufficiency. It's something that we talk about all the time. Utah probably has more preppers than anywhere else except for maybe Montana. And you have all these people who are talking about being self-reliant and self-sufficient and everything else. And yet, we grow 3% of the vegetables we consume, which is beyond pathetic. There is no way that should be occurring with the abundance of farmland, all of the water that we have coming through the winter runoffs, everything that we have available to us, and we're growing 3% of the vegetables we eat, because the vast majority of our fields are in corn, alfalfa, chemically sprayed, and we're just constantly destroying our soil, where everything that we do is going to be to restore the soil, to turn the farm into a very, very highly productive organism that is going to feed lots and lots of people. And so part of why I became a farmer is to show people what they can do, what they're capable of, to help people understand how to grow food, to help people understand there's no reason, particularly here in Utah or anywhere in the country, that we only grow 3% of the vegetables that we eat. We should be growing all of the vegetables we eat. There's no need to be paying for them to be shipped 1,200 miles from Mexico or, parts of California and everything else, for them to come to our grocery stores when we could just grow them here and grow them very easily if we get more and more people involved in this type of lifestyle. Because we are going to look at this as a homestead, even though I do have enough land that we will be commercially farming it. We'll be building more and more greenhouses every single year. We'll be producing more and more food. My goal is that I can set this farm up to be able to feed 1,000 of my closest friends and family if crap were to ever hit the fan. And so when people ask me why I farm, that's why I'm starting the farm. And that's why I love the idea of launching Severely Delicious Foods and inviting you guys along for the journey.